out of the store, and they do it by creating a brand, and a brand that has value in the customer's mind. If I think of companies that are product-led is not necessarily a negative, because obviously companies like Prada and many of the fashion labels and the couture labels are really product-led as well. Because they've really brought something to the customer, they've managed the scarcity of the product, and they've made the product be something that's a bit of a badge that the customer is willing to wear. But most of these companies have only really succeeded is when they really put experience together with product and created a proposition that the customer really values. If I look at brand-led companies, I think of Coca-Cola as a company. It always amazes me that I think of oil as a finite resource. There's no substitute for it, and yet I think of a bottle of Coca-Cola, and it's basically sugar, brown coloring, and water. And yet Coca-Cola sells for about 6 to 7 times the price per liter that petrol sells for. And yet, and one would argue that Coca-Cola's done a much better job branding its product than maybe the oil companies have done. Because the customer is willing to pay a premium for a product that is really not differentiated, in many cases beyond branding. They'll tell you that they'll do the consumer test, and many times consumers can't tell the difference between one cola product and the other. But they've really built a value proposition that's based on branding and the brand position. And this is where creativity, not logistics and operations, have created the value. If I look at a company like Zara, it's a company that is also design-led. And it's design-led in its product, its marketing, its store environment. And it's design-led because in the morning it wakes up thinking about design, and at night it goes to sleep. Its very DNA is based on being in touch with creative and the design process. Now, arguably, they combine that with great logistics, quick-to-market ability in terms of identifying trends and creative trends. But in every case of the way, they don't imitate, they add value. So they're great observers, but they're also great adapters and adjusters of products. So they add much value on the creative end. And if I look at the 360-degree brands, clearly a company like Apple is in this space. A company like Facebook is in this space. If you look at the valuation of companies in the United States, the ones that have the highest valuations in terms of price-earnings ratios are companies that are really creatively led. Harvard did a study in looking at companies and capitalization in the US, and they found that one of the key differentiating factors of the most highly valued companies and the companies that had the highest level of capital but not necessarily most valued is that every one of the highest valued companies had a creative person on its board of directors. Walt Disney Company has Frank Gehry, an internationally known architect, on its board of directors as an example. And you would say, why should an architect be on this board? It's because Disney understands that without their creative process, basically they don't have a product. It's, everything they do is creative-led. So I think today's discussion is a bit about what is the role of the creative process? What is the value? Should the chief merchandising or the chief creative officer of the company make more than the chief operating officer? Should companies really be driven about creating value through creativity rather than seeing creativity as just something that is a style wash or a camouflage that's added at the end of the process? Other companies that are 360 brands include a company called the North Face. This is the company that's the new owner of Timberland. And these are companies that are really built around this creative process, around an enthusiast. So I would really encourage you not to think of creative process as something that only involves brick and mortar, but it also involves lifestyle, psychology, the psychographic of the consumer. It's a creative process that's just not about style and styling, but also about the idea of imagination. Hershey is a company that's almost a 100-year-old company, and yet constantly reinvents itself through creativity. And this is one, I think, the interesting thing again, is the creative process is something that never sleeps. It never stops. But on the other hand, it isn't always about just throwing away what's old and coming up with something new. I was talking to one of the panelists earlier, we were talking about some of the most interesting retailers like Ralph Lauren, or a company called Crate & Barrel in the US. And they haven't fundamentally changed the hard lines or the hardware of their design in 25 years. One of the things I think that's interesting with Indian retail, very often a retailer creates a prototype and a design, and 2 or 3 years later, they're disposing it and creating a new one. If the creative idea was really strategic, and it really was based on a creative philosophy, that idea should last for generations, and it should be constantly improved and renewed and reinvented, but it shouldn't be disposed. If it's an idea that really is disposable, the thought would be it probably was never really very strategic in the first place. So if you think of creative leaders today, these are some quotes from some interesting folks that really have talked about how the creative process adds value. In the Wharton School of Business, which is one of the best MBA programs in the US, talks about in terms of consumer differentiation, that experience among all factors, which is a creative process, is really the major differentiating point between businesses and brands. And the consumer values things like price and convenience much lower than the aspects of experience. So if you think of things about concepts in this, and you think more about individuality, not standardization, you think of the abstract challenge of creativity and how it creates solutions. So in many cases, creative process is really about possibilities, not just about eventualities. An interesting case history that I think would be very interesting as an Indian retailer to look at in the US is a company called JCPenney's. And it's just been taken over, the top leadership position is taken on by a person who really comes out of a creative background and comes out of a retail background, having spent time at Target, and then most recently ran the Apple retail organization. It's a company that in its last year, its stock price dropped almost 60%, and its top store sales went down almost 6%. On the day that Ron Johnson joined the company, and I might add he joined bringing a $50 million personal investment in the company as part of joining. I mean, you talk about skin in the game. To write a $50 million check says, I believe that I can make a difference here. The company's stock price dropped 17% the day it was announced that he was going to take over the company. So the idea that creativity, that somebody that comes out of a 360-degree company can generate that type of movement in the retail community suggests those steely-eyed investment bankers, while they may not talk about creativity, understand how creativity can change the balance sheet of a company. According to an IBM study, more than 1,500 chief executive officers, these chief executive officers they ranked creativity is the most important factor in their business success over elements such as rigor, management discipline, integrity, or vision. Today, the people, the McKinseys, the Bains, these types of groups now are recruiting new strategic advisors and officers, not out of the MBA schools, but they're recruiting them out of places like the Rhode Island School of Design or the Los Angeles Art Center, because they believe that those thinkers actually are able to bring value and think beyond the more basic solutions. So just leave you with a couple thoughts. In looking at the idea of brand, and you think of the Gen Y and the millennial consumers, these consumers all believe that they're inherently creative people. They're judges of creativity. They believe that because they've been creativity today is more of a cerebral process than a craft process. When I started in this business, if you couldn't draw, you could not create. Today, because of technology, everyone can draw. Everyone can create a sense of a place and environment. Everyone believes they can design products. So they're looking for retailers that really are provide partnership in this creative role. They're not looking for it to be something that's separated or relegated to the back office of a retail organization. If you look at what happens with retail experience, the Apple stores in the U.S. are typically 5,000 square feet. They do approximately $35 million per store, so you can do the math there in terms of the productivity of that type of space. And the argument is that, gee, those stores should be busy, that's a lot of business. The reality is the store should be empty because the average sale is about $1,200 per customer. But what happens is people are drawn to participate in the environment and the experience and the gestalt. Many people, the Apple stores actually have relatively low conversion, some of the lowest conversion of any retail store, but they have the highest level of trial of almost any retail store. Because the customer is constantly coming in there wanting to learn what's next. And the reason they do that, obviously besides great product, is a great retail experience and a highly creative approach to developing that retail experience. And so why does experience matter? As I mentioned, Wharton School did an interesting study. And they said of all the great shopping brand experience categories, engagement, executional excellence, that in the end, brand experience is the most important factor of all. And when that brand experience element does not deliver, the customer's likelihood to return drops by 65%. So essentially the brand experience, the creative experience, the retail experience is the #1 motivator that brings customers back to the store. So I'd like to invite my colleagues to join in the discussion and the presentations. And then I think as we move through this, we'll go into maybe a more open discussion with my colleagues. And then so I invite Vishil from Future Group to come up and to share some of his thoughts around the philosophy and the importance of philosophy around